She was 9 years old. It was her birthday. The woman who took care of her had made a pizza so big it could barely fit through the church door. Everyone around her singing, laughing. When it was over, she went to check the mail. Empty. She stood there looking for a while. Then she sat down. "Don't you know, I'm 9 now, Daddy? You said you'd write me letters." Her father was on the other side of the world at that very moment, writing the 10th letter that month. The 10th letter she would never receive. This is Bonnie's story, but it's also yours, because there's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from no one loving you. It comes from not being able to receive the love that was already there. And the cruelest thing about this kind of love is this: you can only see it once it can no longer reach you. When Bonnie was a baby, Kuma would put an iron cage around her before sleeping. Not as punishment, because he knew he could crush her if he turned over in his sleep. An iron cage, built with that specific care of someone who couldn't afford to make a mistake. The first word she said was, "Dad." Sometimes he'd leave on missions. She'd stay with the people of the island, who treated her with affection and held an admiration for her father that she noticed but couldn't yet name. When he passed by, the adults would change. It wasn't fear, it was something else. But he always came back, and when he did, he went straight to her, always. Bonnie was loved, and she felt it. Until one early morning, she woke up and went to find her father coming back from a mission. The sky was still dark, dawn barely beginning. He saw her in the first glimmer of light and stopped. There was a stone below her eye, blue, small. It didn't look right. Before the sun rose, he had already covered every window. She stood in the middle of the church, watching him move through the dark, closing everything, not understanding what was happening, but knowing his face was different from every other day he'd come home. The people of the island didn't understand until they saw her. They were stunned, but her father sent them to call the doctors, several. She stood still while cold hands examined her. She watched her father's worried face, and she knew, in the way a 5-year-old knows things, that things would not be the same. From that day on, the door and windows stayed shut. The island children would sometimes appear outside. She heard the words before she could see the faces, and learned quickly that they were laughing at her. They called the stones ugly things. They called her a vampire. Bonnie didn't cry. She lashed out, with anger, with physical outbursts. Her personality wasn't to shrink down, it was to push back. But inside, she could feel it landing. It wasn't quite shame, it wasn't quite sadness. It was something in between that stayed quiet inside her. And then Kuma would appear. Without her having to say anything, he'd come to where she was, lower himself to her face, and look at the stones the way you look at something valuable, like they were the best part, like they made her more, not less. She never felt ugly when he was nearby. If you've ever had someone who looked at your imperfections like that, you know exactly what she felt. And if you never had it, you also know. And then Kuma would ask, "After you're cured, Bonnie, if we went on a trip, where would you want to go?" She'd go get the book, point at everything, the islands in the sky, Fishman Island, every place she had stored away while staying inside reading. He'd listen with an attention that made the places feel real. They'd play, dance, and laugh, imagining what those adventures would be like. But that same night, the doctor called Kuma to talk outside the church. She stayed inside. She didn't mean to listen, but she heard 10 years. And when her father came back in, she scared him as a joke, and he startled more than usual. She had already arrived at the conclusion before hearing any answer. She was almost smiling, just waiting for confirmation. "I heard that. What about age 10? Kuma looked at her, and in a fraction of a second, he had to say something. The doctor told me that you won't get better until you reach age 10. Right then, she saw hope and asked if she would be cured at 10. Her father saw the whole truth in that moment, saw what it would do to that face, and he chose, with no real way out. Of course, you'll be better when you're 10. Bonnie went to sleep that night with 10 years on her mind. She slept happy. Then time passed, and a year later, that quiet island went through an incident. Something happened on the island that Bonnie didn't fully understand. There were fires, screams, people running. The adults had that look they had when they didn't want to explain anything to her. Her father, the same father she knew as a gentle, careful man who covered windows and built iron cages out of love, that man whom she, with all the innocence of someone who loved him, thought was the biggest coward in the world, suddenly went out to help people. She felt afraid for him. And the next day, people were calling him a king and calling her a princess. She didn't understand, and honestly, she didn't want to. What mattered was that her father was okay, and that her 10 years would arrive, because her mind was focused more and more on the day she'd be able to step into the sunlight. And that same day, something inside her happened. She doesn't know exactly how, but suddenly she was looking at herself and seeing another Bonnie, literally. Her body had changed. She was taller, more grown up, just long enough for her to blink, look again, and see herself as a child. They called it the age fruit. She just thought it was funny. What a strange power. And after that, a brief goodbye. Kuma had to go. She didn't know why, or she didn't pay enough attention. She only knew that he was leaving and she was staying. She didn't cry, she didn't get sad. Her father always came back. The manga doesn't show us what happens to Bonnie during this period. The anime doesn't either. Kuma's story continues elsewhere, and hers stays in the gaps. But you probably know how it is. You know how it is when someone who used to fill the room leaves and the room is suddenly a different size, when the days have a rhythm that doesn't quite close and you can't name what's missing. What Bonnie didn't know was that this wait was still the easy part. She was certain that even with these emotions, her father would come back, and so she wanted to get stronger, because one day she would travel with her father. And Bonnie's certainty came true. Kuma came back, and she ran to jump into his arms, the way a child runs when she's been counting the days without admitting she was counting, with her whole body, no breaks, all the way to him. "I trained while you were gone," she said, still hanging on him, talking too fast to leave any room to breathe between sentences. "When our day comes, I'll already be ready." And to her surprise, her father said they'd be going on a trip together. Imagine the joy. She knew she wasn't cured, and that it wouldn't be the conventional trip she'd dreamed about, but still, one step closer. She got into the trunk and came out on an island that wasn't hers. Different smells, different sounds, different air, inside a high-tech laboratory. And there, in the middle of everything new and advanced, an old man appeared. Huge head, long tongue, a way of talking that made every word sound like the result of an important scientific discovery. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Curable! Bonnie looked at her father, and the two of them celebrated. She was going to be cured. Just like that, the way it should be for a child. Enormous news that fits whole inside one word. While the old man and her father talked off to the side, she went off to explore. She didn't pay any attention to the conversation. She was going to be cured, and there were too many things to see. Kuma came back to her later. "We're going to stay here for 6 months, Bonnie. I also discovered an illness. I'll be running some tests." Worry? No. Children don't think their parents go through hard times too. The opposite, excitement. The two of them would be getting treatment together. Those 6 months were the loudest of her life. There was a big kid she liked playing with, Sentomaru. There was a tall man,
too slow for his age, with dark glasses, who showed up at the most random times. There were sweets, there were pizzas, huge pizzas, so big they barely fit through the door. She'd sit with her father, with the big-headed old man, with Sentomaru, with the guy in dark glasses, and eat with that concentration of someone who has no other worry in the world. At night, sometimes they'd dance. Nika's dance, the one her father had known since he was a child, the one she had learned from him, the one that looked silly and perfect at the same time. She'd dance with her arms up, and the big-headed old man would try to keep up with the rhythm with questionable results. 6 months where love was everywhere around, in the food, in the people, in the noise, and you were inside it like it was the natural state of things, without knowing it was a gift. The 6 months ended. The old man said 1 more year and she'd be 100% cured. Her and her father were beaming. And when she was cured, she wanted to come back, visit the big-headed old man, see Sentomaru, eat more pizza. But first, they were going back to the kingdom of Sorbet, her island. And when they got there, another brief goodbye. Bonney would stay, Kuma wouldn't. He had to leave again. How long? 1 year. But before she could even feel sad about the distance, her father said he would write to her. And that was enough, because her father always came back. This time would be no different. He put his hand on her head and said, "Thank you for being born, Bonney." And she smiled, certain that she was loved. And then he was gone, and she stayed.
The days after Kuma left had a new rhythm. There was a nurse, Alpha, the kind of presence that isn't exactly threatening, but never quite lets you feel comfortable. Every day, the medications, then the mail. Nothing. She waited a week, 2, a month, 2. Her father had promised to write. Her father always kept his promises, so the letters would come. They would come. And then her 9th birthday arrived. Coney had made a pizza so big it could barely fit through the church door. Everyone around her singing, laughing. When it was over, she went to check the mail. Empty. She stood there looking for a while. Then she sat down on the floor. "Don't you know I'm 9 now, Daddy? You said you'd write me letters." A year of treatment passed. The big-headed old man had said 1 year and she'd be 100% cured, and she was. But Alpha said no, that she still had to stay. It was Coney, the woman who had made the pizza, the woman who had been there from the beginning, who came up to her and told her the truth. Alpha was a government agent. Bonney was 10 years old when she became a pirate, and she had to escape. She had to find her father. Coney opened the way, and Bonney used her powers, created the chaos she needed, opened the space she needed, escaped. She took the people of the kingdom with her and went out to sea. Bonney chased her father across the world. She even put a piercing where the stones of her disease used to be, so that her father ever saw her, he'd recognize her. She decided to get famous, so he would see news of her. And so, at just 10 years old, she became one of the worst generation, a supernova. And then she saw it. His face on machines, on the pacifistas, spread across the world as weapons of the world government, with the face of the gentlest man she had ever known, programmed to hurt, programmed to obey, no memory, no choice. She didn't understand. The man who built an iron cage out of love, the man who covered windows before dawn, the man who looked at the stones like they were the best part of her, turned into a weapon. She needed someone to blame, and there was a name, the big-headed old man, the man who had said curable with so much joy, the man who danced Nika's dance with questionable results, the man who had eaten pizza with them, laughed with them, taken care of her father. Vegapunk. A 10-year-old doesn't know what the world government is, but Vegapunk she knew. Vegapunk was the only one smart enough, the man who saved her life and then used her father as material. Hate needs an address, and she had found hers with the logical ease that only childhood has. Then she sailed the seas until she arrived at Egghead carrying a rage with a clear destination. But before reaching that destination, she found her father's memories. I won't describe what she saw. Some things can't be described. What I can tell you is this: she finally received the letters. Not the paper ones, the ones Alpha intercepted, the ones that never arrived, the other ones. The ones he wrote with every choice he made, with everything he sacrificed, with every time he chose her when the entire world was asking for something else. She was 9 years old, sitting in front of an empty mailbox asking if her father had forgotten her. And he had never forgotten, not for a single day. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from no one loving you. It comes from not being able to receive the love that was already there. Bonnie lived this for 2 years, and when she finally received it, when the memories arrived, it wasn't too late. It was exactly the right time. Because love has no expiration date. It stays where it was placed until someone is finally able to pick it up. Is there someone like that in your life? Someone who might be loving you in a way you haven't been able to receive yet? Drop it in the comments, or send this video to that person. And if you want to keep exploring this kind of story, the ones that stay, drop a like and subscribe. Until next time, peace.